Welcome, welcome, welcome. This is TransParents. I am Amber Hollowell, one of your hosts. My pronouns are she, her.
And I am Jenny. My pronouns are also she, her. And hi.
And we are, right? Like last week was a little off.
Yeah.
Because you were mobile.
I was. And I'm sorry I never ended up coming on for the live. I couldn't. It was just such a somber and solemn thing that I was like, man, if I'm whipping out my phone around here, I mean, which people did, don't get me wrong. I took a couple real brief videos for TikTok, but then I was like,
right.
I don't know. So obviously.
No, I got that. That was just a moment that you walked into and just kind of felt it out. And that's why we kind of said, going into it, that we might join you. And then around 7:35 or so, I was kind of like, I don't think she's coming back. And it just kind of carried on. You were where you need to be. I mean, if I'd been closer to you, I would have gone with you. But that's really far to go, unfortunately. At the moment. Oh, comments. Better turn that on. Jeffrey.
Hey, Jeffrey.
He's usually our first one to show up, or at least the first one to show up in comments. And I also say this, it seems like every week we have somebody who doesn't show up, and we wind up when I go back and fill in comments later, I'm like, oh, wow, you were here and why didn't that show up? So sorry, guys.
Who else is here?
Oh my gosh.
He's so big.
He is. How much does he weigh now?
I don't know. I haven't weighed him. Probably a couple pounds, probably 3 pounds, maybe 4 pounds. Shoot, I don't know.
How big do you think he's going to get?
I think he'll get about the same size as my other little Chihuahua mix. They seem to have real similar body styles. So I'm thinking, 7, 8.
Yeah, Pippi was or Jackwa was 6.5.
Yeah.
But I had two rat terriers, and one was 13, 14.
Yeah.
And then the other one, she looked like a rat terrier. We actually had her DNA tested, and she was beagle, and she was like a Heinz 57. She had 9 different types of dogs in her.
Right.
But her main 2 profiles were beagle and Jack Russell. But she looked like a rat terrier. Very sharp, pointy ears, long little whippet tail on her. And she was only 10 pounds. She was smaller than my other one. So she was almost like a big Chihuahua, if you will.
Yeah.
I just found that they were a little more, they weren't as breakable. And I had neighbors who had the teacups, and her daughter had accidentally dropped one, taking it out to the bathroom as a puppy, and the dog broke the dog's leg.
Oh, yeah.
Calls me, and she's like, the dog is screaming, what do I do? And I'm like, go to the vet.
Yeah, that's what my daughter wanted.
And it was so little,
and I was
and it was she went to one, and they were talking about amputating it, and then she took it to our vet, and our vet was it's going to be tedious, but if you come in here once a week, we'll keep recasting it, taking you off and putting another one on, because they grow. As a puppy, she was growing at the same time, and they were really trying to make sure that they kept that ankle. So, and is that the one that just passed? That's the one that just passed, I think.
Oh.
But I mean, she was probably 16 or 17. Yeah, right. Probably. So they have that kind of life. So tonight we're going to talk about Pauli Murray, and there's going to be all kinds of stuff that we go into. I'm going to be reading a lot, because there's just so much on Pauli Murray, and I only found out about Pauli Murray because I had gone to the gender and sexuality summit at Duke back in the fall. And they spoke of the Pauli Murray Center and Pauli Murray. And the Pauli Murray Center is in Durham, which is about 45 minutes from me. And it was just who? And then when you start reading the list of accomplishments, you're really just kind of because I do know about the sit-ins in Greensboro, because I am in North Carolina. I also know about, obviously Rosa Parks. But then to read, and we'll get into it, but her history, she did both of these things years ahead of that.
Yeah.
Years.
Over a decade.
Honestly, and that's honestly, so I'm going to be using she for her pronouns. And we'll
Right.
go into more of that in the end because we do kind of break that down, why I'm using she. Yeah, it's a very long, well, not complicated, but it's a long story. So let me get over here to my, okay, so I can see this, and hopefully y'all can still see me.
Gene, I gotta stop you. It's a little funny. When you first told me that we were going to be doing something on Pauli Murray, I thought you said polyamory. And I was like, okay, I mean, sure. So I was very excited to learn about Pauli, and I loved it. And I watched a few things. Thanks.
She actually, and I'll mention this in here, the name of the movie. It's out, I believe it's on Amazon. I don't know if it's anywhere else, but it's on Amazon Prime. And a movie, like a documentary, was made on her about 3 years ago. And actually, the women who did it, because I read up on it, they were talking about that. Really, that was kind of like the introduction. There was Pauli was very meticulous about her records, so she has everything, and she was even keeping like audio messages up until 1985 when she died of her history. Which, when we start going to what this woman did, you will see why she probably was so meticulous. Yeah. So, and really, these women came across her because they did RGB.
Yeah. And
when they produced RGB, going through some of RGB's records, they found Pauli's name, and they're like, who is this? Who is it? Why haven't we heard of this? And they start doing a back history, and that's why they then did a documentary on her for the same reasons, because it was just like, wow, holy cow. Okay, so it seems inconceivable that someone like Pauli Murray could have slipped through the cracks of U.S. history. Born on November 20th, 1910 in Baltimore, Maryland, Pauli became a lawyer, activist, scholar, poet, and priest, and led a trailblazing life that altered the course of history. She was at the forefront of battles for racial and gender equality, but often so far in front that her contributions went unrecognized. In 1940, 15 years before Rosa Parks, Pauli was jailed for refusing to move to the back of the bus in the Jim Crow South. In 1943, she campaigned successfully to desegregate her local diner 17 years before the Greensboro lunch counter sit-ins of 1960. Her work paved the way from the landmark Supreme Court ruling Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, which desegregated U.S. schools, to the extent that Thurgood Marshall, a lawyer for the NAACP's civil rights group, called Pauli's book, States Law, Race and Color, the Bible for Civil Rights Lawyers. Pauli also co-founded the National Organization for Women, NOW, in 1966 alongside Betty Friedan. When Ruth Bader Ginsburg won the Reed versus Reed case in 1971, which ruled that discrimination on the basis of sex was unconstitutional, her arguments were built on Pauli's work. Ginsburg named Murray as co-author of the brief. We knew when we wrote that brief that we were standing on her shoulders, Ginsburg later said. Ginsburg had given Murray credit for producing the idea early on that the 14th Amendment, which stipulates equal legal protection for all U.S. citizens, could be used to win equality for women. So, I mean, and we'll dive in deeper, flex out some of those parts, but just that, and you're just like, holy cow.
Right.
Because again, I'm in North Carolina. So if she did this at a lunch counter, if she did this, or for her local cafe, and she did this on a bus, why weren't these things taught? Which we know why. But again, it's just kind of insane that here is this one that was right underneath my radar. Right. One of our mutual connections on LinkedIn posted a piece this week from TikTok, and on it there was a sign about Shaw University. I was like, wait a minute. And sure enough, it was from Raleigh, which is right down the road from me. Again, something else I didn't know. And I was just like, I'm so glad I have your content, Tammy. Like, so thankful I have your content to educate me, because I learn about things about my own state that we should have learned about.
Right. Well, I was teaching in the Tulsa public school system from about 2006. Might have been before that, because it was before my son was born. Anyway, until about the 2014 or 15. And it was well into a few years into, and I was teaching in North Tulsa, which is predominantly Black. And our elementary schools were having people come in to talk about the 1921 race massacre of Tulsa. And it was the first time I'd ever heard of it. So then when I went on to teach high school in a kind of a different area in town, but one of the schools a high school that the elementary school that I was teaching, I fed to, there were a lot of teachers who were just like, what? Or they would know about it in passing. And that's, same kind of deal. Like, why aren't we learning about this? This is our local history. And there's a reason why.
The Wilmington race massacre. I didn't hear about that one until George Floyd. I grew up in Eastern North Carolina. Like, Wilmington was 2 hours down the road. Like, what? Well, it's about 2 hours from where I'm at now. Actually, from where I was in Eastern North Carolina, it was more like 3 to get there. But still, it was Eastern North Carolina. That's Eastern North Carolina.
Yeah.
I'm learning about the capital and about the mountains. I should know about what's 2.5 hours, right. 3 hours from me.
Right.
Jeffrey, ignorance. Yes, my friend. Yes. Okay. So Pauli should be celebrated as the American hero, commemorated in stamps, stationery, street names, not to mention biopics. So why is her name unknown? This is one of her quotes. I shall shout for the rights of all mankind. Fortunately, Pauli never threw anything away. So like I said, there's all these vast archives of us to be able to go through and pictures, recordings, all of it. It's no incident that Pauli spent her life fighting against boundaries. She crossed many of them herself. Born in 1910, she was classified as colored in the absolute Jim South era, but her heritage included white and Cherokee ancestry, as well as African American, enslaved people, and slave owners. Her mother died when she was 3, and she was raised by her aunt, Pauline Fitzgerald Dame, in North Carolina. Her father was committed to an insane asylum where he was killed brutally when Pauli was 12. In gender terms, too, Pauli defied the norms. She often dressed and semi-identified as a man. She chose an androgynous-sounding name for herself. Her given name was Anna Pauline Murray, and was attracted to, in her own words, extremely feminine and heterosexual women. A source of considerable anguish. Again, she was far too ahead of her time. Pauli's life is a litany of firsts and onlys. At an early age, she realized that segregation was unjust, and that to change it, she would have to take matters into her own hands. Having appraised that separate but equal was a sham, and school provision for Black children was vastly inferior to that for white kids, Pauli moved to New York at 16 to get a better education. She was the only African American girl in her high school. Here, Pauli immersed herself in the art and politics of the Harlem Renaissance. She befriended poet Langston Hughes and attended lectures by civil rights pioneer Mary McLeod Bethune. She began publishing poems and prose, adopting the gender-neutral name Pauli to affirm her unique identity. In 1938, she applied to the University of North Carolina, which some of her white relatives had attended, even though she knew it did not accept African Americans. Her application was denied. After President Franklin D. Roosevelt visited UNC and gave a speech praising its liberal values, Pauli wrote to him upbraiding him for his silence over civil rights issues. Roosevelt did not reply, but Eleanor Roosevelt did. She later became a close friend to Pauli. I understand perfectly, but great changes come slowly, the First Lady wrote. Pauli was not one to wait. Her spontaneous bus boycott shortly came after. Entering the Jim Crow South in Virginia en route from New York to North Carolina, Pauli and a friend found no colored seats available at the back of their bus, so they remained in the front section. When the driver ordered them to move, they refused calmly and were subsequently arrested. The NAACP was ready to accept their case, intending to challenge Virginia's segregation laws, but the judge sidestepped the issue by charging them with disturbing the peace, which is probably, again, why you didn't hear of this bus incident, because he changed it from that to disturbing the peace.
Yeah.
And probably, again, to keep attention, really, from coming to it.
Absolutely.
Why would you want that to get out? Especially not in the South. Not in the South. Somebody had the guts to do that.
Right. We don't want anybody else getting any ideas.
Right. Ugh. Galvanized by the experience, Pauli enrolled to study law at the historically Black Howard University with a single-minded intention of destroying Jim Crow. She was the only woman in her class. Incredibly, early on in law school, to the ridicule of her tutors, Pauli argued when it came to separate but equal, the problem was not the equal, but the separate. She bet a professor $10 that Jim Crow would be overturned within 25 years and won by 15 years. Pauli was convinced of an inner masculine aspect, describing herself often in a note as a girl who should have been a boy. Pauli came to realize that race was not the only barrier holding her back, though. Despite being top of her class, she was consistently discriminated against. What am I experiencing is what she called Jane Crow. That was confirmed when she applied to Harvard, only to be rejected on account of being female. In her reply to Harvard, she wrote, "I would gladly change my sex to meet your requirements, but since the way to such change has not been revealed to me, I have no recourse but to appeal to you to change your minds. Are you to tell me that one is as difficult as the other?" Harvard did not change its position. However, note in 1965, she became the first African American to receive a Doctor of Juridical Science degree from Yale Law School. Again, first, and not male, first African American, period. Through a combination of activism, intelligence, unshakable determination, and prolific work rate, Pauli set about laying the foundations for ending racial, gender, and economic equality in the U.S. Long before intersectionality was part of the language, Pauli confronted the sexism within the civil rights movement and the racism within the women's rights movement. Pauli pushed the ACLU to take on cases of gender inequality, for example, and criticized the sidelining of women at the historic 1963 March on Washington. Would the Negro struggle have come this far without the indomitable determination of its women? She asked. Similarly, Pauli grew disillusioned with Dow for its centering of white, middle-class women. President John F. Kennedy appointed her to the Presidential Commission on the Status of Women from 1961 to 1963. And then later in life, Pauli was ordained as an Episcopal priest, making Pauli the first African-American woman to achieve this milestone. Again, first. Like everywhere I turned, it was like first, first, first. So despite her advocacy, Pauli never sought a public profile. She was not egocentric or attention-seeking in that way, it seems, although her gender nonconformity must surely have been part of that factor. Pauli Murray had some reasons to want to stay below the radar, being someone perceived by the world to be a woman who had romantic partners who were women was completely unacceptable and not something that Pauli ever talked about openly at that time. Pauli's gender nonconformity was apparent from an early age. As a child, she dressed in boys' clothes, and her aunt called Pauli her little boy girl. Photos of Pauli taken in her 20s during the Depression when she traveled the country hitchhiking and hopping freight trains show her presenting as masculine in leather jackets, trousers, and t-shirts. Pauli labels herself in these portraits with names such as Pete, the Dude, and the Vagabond. I had a boyish bob and a slight figure, flat in the obvious places, which at first light made me appear to be a small teenage boy, she wrote. Pauli did marry a man in 1930, but the relationship did not survive the honeymoon. "Why is it when men try to make love to me, something in me fights?" she wrote in her diary. Pauli was convinced of an inner masculine aspect, describing herself, again, as a girl who should have been a boy. She spent more than a decade seeking medical answers to this, reading up on the latest European research on sexual deviance by figures such as Havelock Ellis, going from doctor to doctor. She investigated hormone treatments and once even requested surgical investigation for the presence of male internal sexual organs, suspecting she might be intersex, and that none were found. The lack of answers or explanations took its toll. Pauli was hospitalized for depression and breakdowns on an almost annual basis. She explored what the options were at a time when those options just weren't known or discussed. It is perilous to retrospectively, and this is where we're going to start going into identity. Because again, Pauli's is more complicated, I would say, than a lot of people. It's perilous to retrospectively ascribe identities, but Pauli's questions and feelings would be recognized by trans and gender nonconforming people today. The assignation of pronouns is also problematic. it's appropriate to consider or refer to Pauli as she, her. Some people call her she, her. Some scholars insist Pauli should be referred to solely as he, him. So the Pauli Murray Center here in Durham opts for using any pronouns, she, he, they, or just Pauli, which they describe as the name Pauli self-assigns so as to encourage the reader to embrace the complexity of the concepts of gender, gender identity, and gender expression. The center currently chooses to use he, him pronouns and they, them pronouns when discussing Murray's early life, and then the she, her when discussing their later years. And I'm not sure. I felt like I had written this in there, but maybe I didn't. I did read that she always referred to herself in her writing as she, her. Now, the like label in the pictures, that was different, but anything that she corresponded in, she wrote as she, her. So that's the reason why I stuck with, and because she, at the end, she was going by she, her. So that's why I just decided hers is so complicated. Just if I kept saying Pauli 1,000 times, they were going to get,
but
Pauli was going to get,
I think that you bring up a really good point. I have not started this book yet because I'm doing it as part of a book club for my parents of queer people, little organization, part of our organization. That's the thing I lead, is that parenting group. And we got the book before we were trans. And I'm very excited to read this. And what I loved was I got to hear the author speak on a podcast. I didn't get to hear him personally, but I got to hear the author speak on a podcast, and they really drove that point home too. It's very tempting to want to assign pronouns and want to assign gender identity to people, especially when we look and we go, well, that's pretty obvious. I mean, if you're saying I'm a girl who should have been born a boy, you're at the very least non-binary, which obviously falls under the trans umbrella, but you're pretty in the clear with the they, them pronoun. But this author did say we shouldn't do that, especially when we have records from that person where they use their own pronouns and it is he or it is she, or and historically they, them isn't probably something that was used, but for that long back. But I really did kind of appreciate that insight, because it's just not up to us to assign anybody's gender. It's not up to us to decide what anyone was or is. And if they don't say specifically, we should just go with what has been specifically. But I think that anybody who was to refer to Pauli as they or he would be correct too. I just appreciate, that's what you've chosen to do. And that's a great explanation of why.
Well, I mean, that's where she was at also when she passed. Everything she was recording and she was writing again was in she, her. So I just feel like that's whatever she had decided, that may have been where we understand that non-binary changes quite a bit. And really any of the gender diversity can change. You can go from trans to non-binary. That doesn't necessarily it's fluid.
Right.
It doesn't have to remain. And so I felt like that's where she was at the end of her life. So I just felt like in presenting this as a whole, that's how I needed to kind of represent her. Because and I get why they're doing it as well. Like, she does refer to herself in a man's name. She transcribes. There was even something that when she was asked, I read something else that said that when she was asked, like when she was corresponding with family members, she would say that she felt like she had a he/she identity, flat out. And again, this is years and years before the term transgender was being used. So there wasn't really a term for it. Non-binary, there wasn't really a term being used for that either at this point in time.
Right.
So, I just feel like that's where she was at. So to be respectful of her, that's kind of where I felt like I'd be. And I hate it for her, because I do think, wow, like if 30 years later, would she have accomplished what she did?
Right.
I don't know. I tried not to judge and say, what if we could change a different route? We had our routes, or at least what's passed. And again, she's passed. And that's another thing, is you can't ask her. If she was still around now, because of the language dynamics and the gender expression and gender identity and all these things that we discuss and we know now with language, she may have chosen to use something different.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, I just again, to be around someone that, or to read about someone that just accomplished so much and have never. I'm in North Carolina. I'm an hour from the I'm less than an hour from the Pauli Murray Center, and no clue,
Yeah.
none. And they kept talking about her at this summit the first day, and I'm just like,
who? Yeah.
who is Pauli Murray? Yeah. And so at night I'm like Googling, and I'm like, whoa, like, wow, what an accomplishment. And I had wanted, we skipped 2 weeks back because I had allergies. And because of that, actually, we had wanted to get Marsha and Polly into Black History Month to honor both of them. And that, again, just her civil rights, her women's rights, just the mass accomplishments. How many people that she knew. I even read, like, there was some stuff about Martin Luther King even would refer back to some of her writings because, like, she wrote what Greensboro went off of. She wrote so much academically with that law degree. And so there was just all this work that she had put into. And so Martin Luther had gotten in, grabbed a hold of some of it. Marshall Thurgood had grabbed on some of it. I mean, some big names. And still
to bring Polly up in RBGs, and I mean that is in itself incredible, but it does
in 1971 too. Like that was 1971.
Absolutely, it does bring to light that issue when it comes to race. Of it took a white woman in power. I recognize that RBG was of Jewish descent, but generally when we think of race, that's white.
Right.
It took a white woman saying something. And one of Pauli's big focuses was that intersectionality. That it was like, you can't have civil rights without addressing women and sex and gender. And you can't have women's rights without addressing minority women, without addressing race. And today, I know that part of what you and I are doing, even though it might not be something we've ever really spoken out loud, it's kind of unsaid. Part of what we are doing is to use what privilege we have to exalt the voices of gender nonconforming, trans, non-binary, and even LGBTQ. We do tend to focus on the T, and but that's part of our privilege, and that's actually something I want to talk about on one of our upcoming episodes. I'm going to do it tonight, but we need to have a whole thing on. It is really time for us all to be speaking up. There are too many people who will show up in a room and say hooray, and that's great, and we love it, and I love the support. But if you personally are not saying something, and you say that you love trans people and you're not against them and you believe they should have rights, nobody knows that if you don't say anything. And it gets easier for those other people to get louder and louder and crazier and more harmful, because if we don't say anything, they think we don't care. It's exactly like I've said about voting. When you don't show up, they don't think you care. What, you're not doing anything to show that you care, so they think they can just run all over you. And I've always said that my whole thing about voting in this state, I'm outvoted every single time, 100% of the time since the day I was born here. Since the day I started voting, I've been outnumbered. But they're going to know I'm here. And we need more voices, not just parents of trans people, not just siblings, not just trans people themselves. Trans people are carrying this burden by them, practically by themselves. They are carrying this burden. And,
they are.
And we need to be speaking up, and we need to be telling people, I will not tolerate you treating other people that way. And when we do that, it's going to be uncomfortable, and we're going to get some pushback. And the only time that really bothers people is if they don't really mean it. Because I'm Your son means it. I know that my son means it. And I know that because despite the abuse they receive, they are still living their truth. They are still out there they're trying their hardest. If I can't be that uncomfortable, what am I doing?
Right.
We owe this to our fellow human beings. So anyway, that was a whole ass rant. I'll save it for the next show. I said I wasn't going to talk about it, and then I proceeded to talk about it.
I think I know what you're talking about, because actually, I was like, I've got some show ideas, and I think the next one we might be already aligned on that. We haven't even talked about it yet. So there we go. But I agree. Like, if other people outside of the allies, meaning the allies that are family, right? Or maybe some close friends, maybe.
Right.
But outside of that group, if everybody else is just like, oh, I agree, but you're never speaking up about it, you're never saying anything about it, you're right. There's like this huge echo chamber. And if everybody who did care about it, who honestly wasn't necessarily directly tied, if you're out there already speaking up, it's a lot harder for that pushback to have room. Because you've got this massive wave. If y'all don't know me, I got this thing about tsunami and waves and stuff. But so you have this massive wave pushing back on that, back against the hate, back against the rhetoric, back against, quite frankly, the misinformation. Because that's what it is.
Yeah.
The misinformation and the fear. I have never, our political candidates that are out there, the rhetoric, like every time, because I'm the mom of a trans kid, which means my feed is typically a lot of LGBTQ news, more on the T, and political, because politics is honestly key to that right now. And if you ask me why, it's because they're the ones pushing the misinformation. They're out there inflaming it. They're out there gaslighting it.
And
at
they're
the
making
podium.
it political. They're making
It's
it
not political.
When you
It's
are
not
passing
political.
laws, when you are enacting bills, that is literally politics.
Yep.
Trans people going to a doctor is not political. That's healthcare. Trans people wearing clothes is not politics. It's fashion. It's covering your body. When you start making laws and start enacting bills and start, speaking at campaigns and now you've made it political. So what is it do except meet that? And Pauli wasn't afraid to meet that. She wasn't afraid to say it. And we know, I can say a lot of things about being the parent of a trans kid and that it's scary, but I'm here to tell you, I am well aware of the privilege of being the parent of a white male trans kid. He is of the trans people, he is the safest.
The least. Yep.
He is the safest. He is the least likely to be harmed. And I think that non-binary people are even more likely to be harmed than a white male trans person, because people are just so offended by this they them idea, which is so stupid. But Pauli
it really is
that. And to be gender non-conforming in their dress, y'all, I can't remember what year it was. It was in the 70s. It was either right before I was born. I was born in 78. So it was right around that time that a teacher showed up at a trial. And I can't remember what the trial was about. It wasn't about her. She showed up in slacks and a blouse. And the judge said, you go home. You put on a skirt. Do not come back into my courtroom without a skirt on.
And she did that.
Pauli was
where was it? Because if it was in the 20s, if she was in her 20s doing it, that was in the 1930s that she was wearing pants.
That's right. So Pauli wasn't afraid to stand up for that. And thankfully never lost, their life as a result. And I'd love to have them still here with us today to do that work. But how many people do we not even know about right now who are doing that? We know the ones that we see on the news, and we know the ones whose faces are out there. But there are people right now who are still working, and they're still grassroots, and they're putting in that work, and they're doing their best.
Yep.
We need to be amplifying their voices. We need to put in the spotlight on them more. I love this idea of maybe once a month finding someone that's in the news now, or that's on the front lines now. Obviously, we've got
Mm-hmm.
some really, easy ones to choose from,
Right.
but finding other people and putting a spotlight and saying, this is the work that people are doing, so that one day it's not, our grandkids going, what? I didn't know you lived during the time of, so and so, when they were doing all this work, and we go, I didn't either.
Do that again. We as adults we're doing that. And it's like, no, let's not repeat this. Please. We want better for our kids. Like the younger generations, we're supposed to want progress. We're supposed to want change. We're not supposed to want rollback.
No.
Nobody's ever said, let's roll it back.
Oh,
I'll be honest.
they say it all the time. They want to go back to the good old days.
There wasn't a good old day. There wasn't a good old day. That's the problem. Is everybody keeps championing a good old day. Well, I mean, I'm saying, well, it was for white men.
Right. If you were a white male or a white cisgender female with a wealthy male husband, I mean, let's keep it real.
Right.
Yeah, there were some good old days, but that was for you personally.
But everybody else.
That wasn't for everybody.
Right. No. I mean, I came from a family that was like that, and I was born in the late 70s. So what I had here, Rosalind Rosenberg, a biography of Pauli, observed her sense of in-betweenness made her increasingly critical of boundaries, and that allowed her to make one of the most important ideas of the 20th century, that the categories of race and gender are essentially arbitrary and not a legal basis for discrimination. Right? Like, just dang.
It's all arbitrary. It's all made up.
Right? Had she been born later, I'm sure Pauli would have argued the same for sexuality and gender identity. She might well have been active in the next civil rights frontier for LGBTQ plus rights. As it was, Pauli surprised many by renouncing her professorship at Brandeis University in 1973 to become the priest in the Episcopalian Church. No one could accuse Pauli of not having done enough. Recognition for Pauli is at least growing beyond academia and Black historians now. Her childhood home in Durham, North Carolina, was declared a National Historic Landmark in 2016 and now houses the Pauli Murray Center. Yale University has named a residential college after Pauli. Her poetry and autobiography, Song in a Weary Throat, have been republished. It would be premature to say Pauli's time has come, but as Murray put it, I live to see my lost causes found. Those found causes are in danger of being lost again. In today's U.S., however, Pauli would be appalled to see the rollback of Roe versus Wade, or the trumped-up furor over critical race theory, which is being used to criminalize the teaching of race-related history, or Republican-orchestrated voter suppression efforts, or attempts to restrict transgender access to bathrooms in states including Pauli's own North Carolina. There is clearly still work to be done. Pauli has shown us how to do it with intelligence, imagination, and determination in the face of defeat. When my brothers try to draw a circle to exclude me, I shall draw a larger circle to include them, she wrote in 1945. Where they speak out for the privileges of a puny group, I shall shout for the rights of all mankind. With humility, but with pride, I shall offer one small life, whether in foxhole or in wheat field, for whatever it is worth, to fulfill the prophecy that all men are created equal. My Name is Pauli Murray is the name of the film. And again, it was released like 3 years ago, and it's on Amazon Prime, so that you can get even more. And it kind of goes through a lot of what I went through. Lots of her pictures, because again, she was a meticulous record keeper. So she has all this information stored. There's a treasure trove of it at Pauli Murray, the center, and I actually put the links. That the center for the link is actually in our resources, the resource box underneath the event. If y'all want to look in the comments, I listed that there. And there's like 4 or 5 other articles there that I pulled information for tonight as well. But I cannot, the guts at that time. I mean, that was just huge. Hell, for that matter, 16 and said, oh, I'm going to go to New York and go to high school. Like, That would have been what, 20 or not 20, 1926, I think. Because I believe it said she was born in 1910.
Yes.
So that would have been 1926. She was in North Carolina and said, I'm going to New York. Education's better up there.
What a baddie.
Right? Like, even as a kid, she was a baddie. Like, total. You weren't going to, it was evident. Like, the whole thing, like, when Harvard said no, and she comes back and she's like, well, if I could change my sex, I would, but I looked that up and I can't find a way to do that yet. So how else am I supposed to fit your category? And then it called Roosevelt out. After Roosevelt came to UNC and spoke and didn't mention civil rights, and so she writes a letter to him calling him out. And it's just kind of like, and apparently, I did not find that out. I wish I knew how exactly Eleanor got the letter to know about that, to write her back. Because they become friends over that. Like, she reaches out to her and they kind of like create this bond. And I would love to know, like, okay, so did he just come home one day and be like, I got this letter today? And I can't believe somebody called me out.
People probably wrote letters to the president and they were like, I can't read all these. Here, honey, you read them and tell me what's important. I mean, that sounds like something some man would ask his wife to do for him, as if she doesn't have anything better to do. But, thank goodness she did it.
Right. And again, it's kind of half of the quotes that I got were from white women that were involved in her life. Yeah. And luckily that was kept, right? Because, I mean, just her achievements is so early compared to anything else that we've talked about, learned about. And it is to bury progress.
And queer people deserve to know that they have a rich history of people doing this, standing up for this, that these people paved that path for them. I think something that, I mean, it bothers me, I'm not gonna lie, but there's nothing I can do about it. It just is what it is. I feel like a lot of young queers have no idea of their history. That got paved for them and got done for them, and they're enjoying the fruits of that labor, and that's great. They should. But even as women, we have heard, I can't remember what it is, but it was pretty recently, you started hearing people come back with, well, I mean, men gave women the right to vote. And I'm like, no, sir. No, that did not happen.
No.
Women died so that I could vote. Women were beaten and jailed and mistreated so that I could vote. And knowing our history, knowing who came before it and what they did, does give us some reverence for it. And for that, I take my right to vote very seriously. I hold that dear, because there are so many women in other countries in 2024 who can't vote. And I can is because other women came before me and they stood up for that right and they did the hard work. And, I owe it at least that respect. So I wish more people would, get interested in their own history. But, you can't, I think sometimes that also is just a thing that comes later in life.
You start getting inquisitive of where did I come from? Where did these structures? How was this built?
Right.
I do think, like, I wasn't as interested. Like, I mean, I learned what I got from school, but then I really probably didn't really start getting into more like trying to figure out who I was, unpacking my racism, like all of those kind of things kind of started for me in my 30s and then forward from there, which, I mean, I went to school, started going back to school in my early 30s. And so I did a lot of deep dives on, global prejudice. And I mean, classes that really, really dived into it and where these structures were created. But again, I'm in North Carolina, you're in Oklahoma, and our states pass legislation on what we can and can't be taught. And there's a reason why their history is not being said or taught or shared, because then that gives them what? Anybody want to take a guess? Courage, a foundation, strength to
Right.
build from. And
Well,
instead, they want them to feel like they don't have a footing whatsoever. They don't want them to feel like, okay, this hasn't been around. And that's the other thing. If you're not teaching it, when you've got politicians that are out there right now going, oh, transgenderism, like transgenderism is new, and they're pushing it in schools. It's been here, guys. Stonewall riots we learned about last week.
Yeah.
Pauli Murray, 1910.
Yeah.
She was dressing as a boy as a child, which would have been in the 19s.
Yeah.
And that's not being taught. It's not being shared, because if you shared that, then you wouldn't be able to, your politicians wouldn't be able to go out there and say, this is new, this is new.
Right. And, you know, then you got people like, the guy down in DeSantis, sorry guys, who, you know, likes to say that slavery benefited Black people. What? No, being owned never benefits anyone. There's not a benefit to being property. I can't, I mean, my dog, it benefits my dog, who's a dog, not a human. So
right.
And it doesn't benefit all dogs, that's for sure. So yeah,
no.
when you don't teach history fully, and you don't teach it, you know, just honestly, just with some honesty and some humility. Hey man,
right.
How do you think Germany felt coming out of World War II? How do you think Germany felt about educating its upcoming generations on, here's what we did? I mean, it would be embarrassing to say the least, but it's okay to be embarrassed about history. It's not it's good sometimes to be embarrassed. As a person in recovery, I had better be embarrassed about my past. This whole idea that, oh, you should never be ashamed. Baby, my shame has kept me sober some days. When I have wanted to do something and I have thought back to the hurt that I've caused someone, to the embarrassment I've been, it's a powerful tool.
No, I don't want to go there again.
It's a powerful tool, and I don't live in shame. I don't sit around having a miserable life, you know, lamenting my past. My past is my past. But if you ask me about it, I'm going to be honest. Because otherwise I don't care. I don't mean it. And if I don't care and I don't mean it, then I don't stay sober. If we don't care and we don't mean it, we're just going right back. Because why wouldn't we?
Right.
It's very convenient to be in power. It's very convenient to be the race that can do whatever it wants.
Yep.
Convenient for
it really is.
Not for people. So we have to be willing to deal with the discomfort of that inconvenience, and that we have to be willing to deal with the discomfort of embarrassment or shame. It's okay to feel that way. And I stand by, if you can take pride in being an American, which has nothing to do with anything except some random lottery of birth, then you can have some shame in what this country's done and what it continues to do. If you can take part in the pride, which you did not earn, then you can take part in some of that shame and embarrassment too, if only to make it better, to do better, learn from it. That's what it's there for. We can't go back and change it, but we can do better. And we owe it to Marsha. We owe it to our kids today, and we owe it to the next generation to keep pushing for the kind of change, to be brave. They were courageous people. This took courage. And to
a lot. I mean, it just brings home the whole thing with next as well, that again, there's just no, you have these kids that are out there struggling, trying to be brave and courageous enough to be themselves, trying to balance all this inner turmoil with, quite frankly, puberty and adolescence and bullies at high school and middle school. Like there's, and that's not even if the family is supportive. You could have a kid who's in an unsupportive family who's literally living in the closet. And if you don't share this information in the schools, that Stonewall riots, that there is a basis for this, then they do feel very excluded. It makes them feel more isolated. It leads, frankly, to more depression and mental health issues. And if the focus is on children, the focus is on saving them, then let's actually save them. Because what we've been doing is not saving them whatsoever. We see that. We saw that a couple of weeks ago.
To be on all children. It doesn't matter what their gender is. It doesn't matter what their sexuality is. It doesn't matter what their clothes are, what their disability is, what their mental health is. If we care about children, why isn't it all children? It should be all children. And this idea that these young people aren't really trans, they're just mentally ill, I disagree. But if you're right, why are we treating mentally ill people wrong? If you're correct, again, I disagree. But even if, is that how we treat mentally unwell people? Is that how we treat mentally unwell children? No, it's not. We don't try to make their lives worse. There shouldn't be.
We shouldn't try to make their lives miserable. I mean, this isn't just worse. This is miserable. This is making them feel like they are targeted left, right, and center. There is a bullseye in every direction on specifically the kids.
By their
Once they get to adulthood,
government, not
right?
by bully a-hole kids. Every kid deals with an a-hole bully at some point. We get it. Oh, everybody's kids get bullied. Okay, yeah, you're right. But one day we try to tell them, hey, you're going to grow up. It's not always going to be like this. You're going to get out of there. You can change schools. There's things you can do. When you're targeted by your own government, that's mind-boggling to me.
There's nowhere to go.
And as a woman, I feel that as far as women's rights and women's reproductive rights, but I still have the power to vote. You're talking about kids. They have no power at all.
Nope. And if they have unsupported families, they have even less power.
Even less.
Right?
Right? It's like a negative. You're just starting so far ahead of the starting line, so far back. And it's unjust.
We are talking about the voting. We have my primary is Tuesday. And so I've got my written ballot, and my stepdad earlier was like, hey, what do you know about some of these? Do you know stuff about certain candidates? Because he wasn't finding, honestly, my parents were trying to find who was supportive of gender affirming rights, right? And I had gone through all the school board candidates, and because I'm unaffiliated, that's all I can vote on this time in the primary right now is Board of Education. And none of them come out and specifically say it. You have a couple who will say, I think children should be respected. All children should be respected and met where they're at. There's some that use the lingo of, I think parents' opinions should not be forced on everyone. So you could read between the lines.
Right.
But I was so peeved that I can't even, you won't even come out and say it.
Right.
Like, we know that's what they targeted on our Board of Education. We know that we've got Proud Boy, 3%er. We've got it all, right?
Right.
Right? Corrupt, fired detective, whole 9 yards. And they keep getting in. And they're the ones that have gone out there and labeled schools and said, hey, they've got litter boxes and they're walking kids around with leashes. And none of it was going on. But this was like the school board going out and saying this. And it's not happening. Like, one of our charter schools nearly was shut down because of it.
I kind of understand in a way, the more leftist, or, I don't even know the words anymore. Liberal, left, Democrat, I don't care.
Okay.
That side, the correct side, in my opinion.
Human rights.
And wanting to be like, hey, what's important is that I get in there. And if it takes more like chilled out language and not being direct about it that gets me there, cool. It's easy. I understand that. I get it.
I think that's what my
I
parents were kind of like reading through. They're like, can you find anything? And I was like, and we have like a local group. Last year, I was or not last year, but in 2022, I was very, very active because we had a big section of school board and everybody else coming in, and we were trying to educate our local community. And then I kind of stepped back out of that. And so I knew where to go into the group to look for the information. And it's just, and that's why I left the group, because it's like MAGA-itis in there. They have come in and have infiltrated. And that's what we were always fighting. But it's like triple fold now. And I'm not, my life is not to combat that every single day in a forum. Sorry.
Right.
I got bigger fish to fry.
Right.
But I did know I could go there and like find the scoop, like the local school board candidates, because they are looking at that. They have asked those questions. They've gone to the meetings. And with my help, I'm not trying to get out in all of that. I keep up with the meetings, the notes that are put out afterwards and that kind of thing. But I'm just glad my kids aren't in the school system anymore here.
Oh,
really glad.
But I get it. I get it. It's just so goofy. It's really goofy. I don't know how my son's doing right now. He went home to see his dad last weekend. He doesn't come home every weekend. He's got a job. He's at university. He's an hour and a half away. So I totally get it. But when he does, maybe one weekend a month, he will do his dad's 1 month and he'll do my house next month. And he still will come say hi to each of us, but like spend the night there, stay there. And I don't know what happened, but I know that all of a sudden I noticed he does still share his location with me on his phone. And that is strictly for safety. I do not police him. That is not my job.
Right.
But I check it every now and then. And I've been noticing that he's been at his girlfriend's place, which is not in his city by his university. His girlfriend goes somewhere else for school. And I was like, hey, buddy, I noticed you've been spending quite a bit of time, in this town. Are you getting to class? And he was like, yeah, I mean, I let my teachers know about some absences. I said, well, what's going on? Because I can't afford to pay for tuition class he doesn't go to. I cannot afford that. I can't afford to go and pay for shit he does go to.
Mine dropped. Mine came home second semester of his freshman year.
Yeah. And we'll see. He's always welcome to. We'll make it work. But either way, he said, yeah, I was at Dad's house over the weekend. And he just has such an issue with me being trans. And, it's not an excuse. Well, buddy, people are going to have a problem with that. Go to class. What you are striving toward is your future. What you're worried about is his attitude now. So you need to be striving. But I don't have that experience. So I don't know what kind of toll that takes on his mental health to go try to be with his dad and then have a bad experience. And it really, people think, well, I'm going to set this standard or this expectation, and somehow my kid is going to rise to it. You're just making a mentally unhealthy, miserable kid.
Yeah.
And one day you're going to be like, why don't they talk to me anymore? Why don't they involve me? And why didn't they invite me to their wedding? Well, why the frick do you think? I mean, you stupid? Quit acting stupid. This is your child. Do you want to have a relationship with them or not?
Well, I think that's the reason why my ex started kind of like really picking up when the other two started to kind of get back in contact with him a couple of years ago, that he still wasn't. And he would constantly quiz the other two, what's going on. And they would just kind of blow it off. And then I think he kind of, did he finally land on it? No, he hadn't come out to him. No. My son didn't come out to his dad for like probably another 4 years,
Wow.
maybe longer. I mean, he was in Florida. Like, I mean, just they don't have a lot of communication. It's once a year, twice a
Oh,
year.
okay, I see
I mean,
that.
they have like some Instagram crap, but as far as like actually speaking, they just at that point in time, they still weren't. Like, there was a big gap. Pretty much all of my kids' high school and a year or so after that, there was no a birthday card and a Christmas like deposit. That would be it. Yeah. So he didn't, and he knew his politics. He didn't know how he would accept him.
Yeah.
He didn't think he would accept him, so he just didn't for the longest time. And then, like I said, I think my other two had gone down, and I think he kind of like sort of landed on it. He kept trying to guess it, and I think he finally landed on it. And I think maybe my daughter finally was like,
right. Just kind of a
yeah. And that
yes,
kind of, I think they just took the pressure off of him to have to like broach the conversation, because he didn't completely balk at it. Like, he wasn't, oh no. And so that, but it was enough that he realized he wasn't going to have, literally, he wasn't going to have a relationship if he didn't show some kind of understanding to it.
Yeah.
Now, for him, when my daughter moved in November, for him to then turn around and go, oh, well, when are you coming to visit? And he's in Florida, guys, in Miami. And so everybody's just kind of like looking at them like, are you really? Are you not getting it? And it finally dawned on him, oh, Florida.
Yeah.
And next he wants to move to Tennessee. And I asked my daughter, I was like, is he ever going to move somewhere where his son can safely travel to?
Right.
Ever?
Yeah.
Anyway, we have run out of time. Sorry, folks. We're over. And we're going to, well, I don't know what next week's topic is. We're going to talk before I actually announce it on the show. But we'll be back here next week. Can't wait. See y'all
soon.
Right? Love y'all.
Love you. Smooches and love. Bye.
Bye.